21 miles. That's all that separated Britain from total annihilation in the summer of 1940. 21 miles of water called the English Channel. On one side, the most powerful military machine ever assembled, an army that had just conquered France in 6 weeks, swept through Poland, crushed Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands like they were made of cardboard. On the other side, an island nation that had just watched its army barely escape from a beach in France, leaving behind every tank, every artillery piece, every vehicle they owned. And standing between invasion and survival was one man's refusal to do the sensible thing. Here's what makes this moment in history absolutely electrifying. Winston Churchill had every logical reason to negotiate peace with Hitler. Every military expert, every strategic calculation, every rational analysis said that Britain couldn't win alone. Churchill's own war cabinet was urging him to seek terms. The smart people, the experienced people, the careful people all said the same thing. Save what you can, negotiate while you still have something to negotiate with. Don't sacrifice British cities and British lives in a fight you cannot win. And Churchill, looking at all that logic, all that sensible advice, said one word: no. This is the story of that refusal and the 12 weeks that followed. 12 weeks when the fate of the modern world hung on whether a few hundred young men could keep obsolete fighter planes in the sky long enough to prevent an invasion. But here's what you need to understand to grasp why this story matters today. This wasn't fought on some distant battlefield. This was fought in the skies above London, above English villages, above people's homes. Ordinary British citizens looked up every day and watched their future being decided in real time through vapor trails and falling wreckage. They could see whether they were winning or losing. They could count the parachutes. They could see the bombers getting through. There was no hiding the truth. And here's the hook I need you to hold on to because it will determine whether you understand why this story still matters today. At 3 specific moments during that summer, Hitler's invasion of Britain should have succeeded. 3 moments where the mathematical odds, the strategic situation, and the balance of forces all lined up in Germany's favor. At each of those moments, something unexpected happened. A decision, a mistake, a refusal to accept what should have been that changed the outcome. By the time you reach the end of this story, you'll know exactly what those 3 moments were and why they matter. The first moment came before the battle even started, in a room in London where Churchill faced down his own government. The second came in mid-August when the Royal Air Force was within days of collapse. The third came in early September when Hitler made a decision that changed the war. Stay with me and you'll see how each of these moments built on the others to create an outcome that nobody predicted. But to understand how close it came to going the other way, we need to go back to May 1940 when Britain's situation went from bad to catastrophic in a matter of days. May 10th, 1940. 2 things happened on that day that would determine the future of the world. First, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. Second, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain. The timing wasn't coincidental. Britain's previous Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had lost the confidence of Parliament over the failed Norway campaign, and Churchill, despite being controversial and distrusted by many, was the only figure who commanded enough support to form a government in the crisis. Winston Churchill was 65 years old. His career had been a roller coaster of brilliant successes and catastrophic failures. He'd been in Parliament since 1900. He'd held major positions in government during World War I, including First Lord of the Admiralty, but his reputation was permanently scarred by the Gallipoli campaign, an amphibious assault on Turkey that resulted in enormous casualties and strategic failure. Throughout the 1930s, while he was out of government, he'd warned constantly about the Nazi threat, about German rearmament, about the danger of appeasing Hitler. Most people dismissed him as a warmonger, an alarmist, someone stuck in the past. When war finally came in 1939, he was proven right. But that didn't mean people trusted his judgment. Being right about one thing doesn't erase a history of being wrong about others. So Churchill took office with a weak political position. He didn't have universal support in his own Conservative Party. Many senior politicians thought he was reckless. His coalition government included people who fundamentally disagreed with his approach. And he took office on the exact day that Germany began its military campaign that would destroy France. Let me be clear about what happened in France because you need to understand the scale of the disaster to grasp why Churchill's later decisions seemed so insane. The German attack on France was a masterpiece of military planning. Everyone expected Germany to attack through Belgium, just like they had in World War I. The French had built the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications along their border with Germany, specifically to force any German attack to go through Belgium. The French and British strategy was to rush their best troops forward into Belgium the moment Germany attacked, establish defensive positions and fight the battle there rather than on French soil. The Germans did attack through Belgium, but that wasn't the main attack. That was a feint, a distraction. The real attack came through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and Luxembourg, a region of dense woods and hills that the French High Command had declared impassable for tanks. The French had only light forces guarding the Ardennes because they were convinced no major mechanized force could get through. They were catastrophically wrong. German panzer divisions led by generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel pushed through the Ardennes in 3 days, crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, smashed through weak French defenses, and began racing west toward the English Channel. They weren't trying to conquer territory, they were trying to cut off the Allied armies that had rushed into Belgium. It was a sickle cut, designed to trap the best Allied troops in a pocket with their backs to the sea. The speed was breathtaking. On May 10th, the campaign began. By May 20th, 10 days later, German tanks reached the Channel coast at Abbeville. The trap was closed. The entire British Expeditionary Force, nearly 400,000 men, along with the best of the French army, were surrounded in a pocket around the port of Dunkirk, with German forces pressing in from the south and east. What happened next was called the Miracle of Dunkirk, though calling it a miracle disguises what a disaster it actually was. The Royal Navy, along with hundreds of civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, anything that could float, evacuated 338,232 British and French soldiers from the beaches at Dunkirk between May 26th and May 4th, 1940. It was an extraordinary feat of logistics and courage. The civilian boat owners who crossed the channel to help rescue soldiers were genuine heroes. The naval officers who organized the evacuation under constant air attack did remarkable work. But here's what Britain left behind at Dunkirk: 2,472 artillery pieces, 20,000 motorcycles, 65,000 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, 416,000 tons of stores and supplies, and virtually all of their tanks and heavy equipment. Britain came home with their rifles and the clothes they were wearing. Nothing else. Britain had evacuated its soldiers but lost its army's equipment. It would take months to re-equip those forces. Meanwhile, France was collapsing. The Germans wheeled south from the Channel coast and drove toward Paris. The French army, psychologically shattered by the speed of defeat, couldn't form a coherent defense. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The French government fled. And on June 22nd, 1940, 6 weeks from the start of the German offensive to the French surrender. Let that sink in. 6 weeks from the start of the German offensive to the surrender of France. France, which had been considered to have the strongest army in Europe. France, which Britain had counted on as their primary ally. France, which stopped Germany in World War I. 6 weeks. Now Britain was alone. Truly, completely alone. Across the English Channel, the German army controlled Europe from Norway to the Spanish border. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had bases all along the French coast, putting all of southern England within easy range. The Wehrmacht, the German army, had just demonstrated that it could destroy the best armies in Europe in weeks. Hitler controlled more territory than Napoleon ever had, and he'd done it in less than a year of serious fighting.
And Britain had an army that had just lost all its equipment, an air force that was outnumbered, and a navy that, while still powerful, couldn't operate in the Channel if Germany controlled the air above it. This is the situation Churchill faced at the end of May 1940. And this is where we reach the first of those 3 critical moments I mentioned at the start, the moment when Churchill faced down his own war cabinet and made the decision that kept Britain in the war. The War Cabinet was a small group of senior ministers who made the crucial decisions. Churchill was Prime Minister and chaired it, but he didn't have absolute authority. The most important other member was Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. Halifax was everything Churchill wasn't: careful, diplomatic, aristocratic, measured. He'd been Foreign Secretary under Chamberlain and was seen by many as a steadier hand than Churchill. And Halifax believed, genuinely and deeply, that Britain should seek peace terms with Germany. Halifax wasn't a coward, and he wasn't a Nazi sympathizer. His position was based on cold analysis. Britain couldn't defeat Germany alone. The United States was neutral and showed no signs of entering the war. American public opinion was strongly isolationist. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression act with Germany in 1939 and was actively trading with the Nazis. There were no allies available. France was gone, Poland was gone, most of Europe was either conquered or neutral. Halifax looked at the strategic board and concluded that Britain had two choices: negotiate now, while Britain still had its empire, its fleet, and some bargaining power, or fight until those assets were destroyed and then have to negotiate from a much weaker position. He argued that Hitler would offer reasonable terms. Germany would dominate Europe, but Britain could keep its empire and its independence in domestic affairs. The alternative was to fight a war Britain couldn't win, resulting in the destruction of British cities, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of British civilians in bombing raids, and eventual defeat anyway. On paper, Halifax's argument was logical. The problem was that it depended on believing Hitler would honor whatever terms he offered. Churchill didn't believe that for a second. The War Cabinet meetings at the end of May 1940 were some of the most important political discussions in history, and we have detailed records of them. The debate went on for days. Halifax had support from other cabinet members. There was serious discussion of reaching out to Mussolini, the Italian dictator, to broker negotiations with Hitler. The Italian ambassador was actually contacted about potential terms. Churchill argued against a negotiation on multiple fronts. Strategically, he argued that any terms Hitler offered now would be abandoned the moment it was convenient for him, that negotiating with Hitler was like feeding a crocodile and hoping it would eat you last. Practically, he argued that even discussing terms would destroy British morale and make it impossible to continue fighting if negotiations failed. And morally, he argued that there were worse things than losing a war, and one of them was surrendering without fighting. There's a moment recorded in the cabinet notes from May 28th where Churchill says something revealing. He acknowledges that Britain might ultimately lose. He doesn't promise victory. What he says is that if Britain must go down, it should go down fighting, because that would be remembered with honor, whereas seeking peace terms would be remembered with shame. He's not making a practical argument there. He's making an argument about identity, about who the British people understood themselves to be. The argument was close. If Halifax had voted for negotiation, Churchill would have had to resign or be overruled. Britain would have sought peace terms. The war in Western Europe would have effectively ended with Hitler in control of the continent. But Churchill won the argument, barely. By the narrowest of political margins in a fragile coalition government, he got the War Cabinet to reject negotiation and commit to fighting on. And this is the first of those three moments I told you about. May 28, 1940. If Halifax had won that argument, Britain would have begun peace negotiations. There would have been no Battle of Britain because Britain wouldn't have been fighting. Germany would have controlled Europe, America would likely have stayed neutral indefinitely, and the entire course of the 20th century would have been different. Churchill's political courage in that moment, his willingness to bet everything on continued resistance when all the practical arguments went the other way, kept Britain in the war. But now he had to deliver on the implicit promise that Britain could actually hold out, that the fight wouldn't be futile. And that depended on the Royal Air Force. Here's what Germany needed to do to invade Britain: achieve air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. This wasn't optional, it was an absolute requirement. The German plan, called Operation Sea Lion, required transporting hundreds of thousands of troops across 21 miles of water. The Royal Navy was still powerful. It could destroy an invasion fleet if it could operate. But the Royal Navy couldn't operate in the Channel if German aircraft controlled the sky above it. German dive bombers would sink British warships before they could reach the invasion fleet. Similarly, the German invasion fleet, barges, transport ships, fishing boats, anything that could carry troops, would be sitting ducks for British air attack if the Royal Air Force was still operational. German troops packed into slow-moving barges couldn't defend themselves against strafing attacks by British fighters. So before Operation Sea Lion could happen, the Luftwaffe had to destroy the RAF. This was Hermann Göring's job. Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, one of Hitler's oldest allies and supremely confident in his air force. The Luftwaffe had just crushed the Polish Air Force, the Norwegian Air Force, and the French Air Force. It had provided crucial support to the army during the invasion of France. Göring told Hitler destroying the RAF would be easy. 4 days to defeat it in southern England, 4 weeks to destroy it completely. The numbers seemed to support Göring's confidence. The Luftwaffe had approximately 2,800 aircraft available for the campaign against Britain, about 1,400 bombers, 1,200 fighters, and various reconnaissance and support aircraft. Fighter Command, the branch of the RAF responsible for defending British airspace, had about 640 fighter aircraft available at the start of August 1940, mostly Harrier Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires. On paper, the Germans had overwhelming numerical superiority. They outnumbered the British roughly 2-to-1 in fighters, even worse in overall aircraft numbers. They had more experienced pilots. Many had been in combat in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, then in Poland and France. They had recent experience of successful campaigns. They had momentum and confidence. Britain had every reason to be terrified, but Britain also had advantages that weren't immediately apparent, advantages that would prove crucial in the weeks ahead. The first advantage was simple geography. British pilots who were shot down, if they survived, landed in Britain. They could be back in a cockpit within days. German pilots who were shot down either died in the Channel or became prisoners of war. They were lost permanently. This drastically changed the mathematics of attrition. Both sides would lose aircraft, but Britain could recover pilots and put them back into combat. Germany couldn't. The second advantage was revolutionary technology that even most British people didn't understand: radar. Britain had constructed a chain of radar stations along its eastern and southern coasts. These towers could detect incoming German aircraft while they were still over France or the North Sea. The radar operators couldn't identify the aircraft types or exact numbers, but they could see that something was coming, roughly how many aircraft, what altitude, and what direction. This gave Fighter Command precious minutes of warning. British fighters didn't need to fly standing patrols, burning fuel and exhausting pilots waiting for attacks that might come from any direction. They could wait on the ground, engines warm, pilots ready, until radar showed exactly where the Germans were coming from. Then they could take off, climb to altitude, and be positioned to intercept when the German formations crossed the coast.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The Germans knew the radar towers existed. They could see them, and they'd attacked some of them, but they didn't fully grasp how revolutionary the system was. They thought the towers were for ship detection or general early warning. They didn't understand that Britain had built an integrated system that fundamentally changed the nature of air defense. The third advantage was that Britain had built not just radar, but a complete command and control system around it. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command, had spent years building this system, often fighting with his own superiors who didn't understand what he was doing. Here's how it worked. Radar stations detected incoming raids and reported to filter rooms at Fighter Command headquarters. Operators in the filter rooms corroborated the radar reports with visual sightings from the Observer Corps, volunteers stationed at posts across Britain with binoculars and telephones. The combined information was plotted on large maps. Sector controllers at airfields could see the developing picture and scramble squadrons to intercept. Fighter pilots received radio directions, guiding them to the enemy formations. It sounds simple, but it was years ahead of any other nation's air defense system. It meant that British fighters were usually in the right place at roughly the right time. Not always. The system had gaps, communication failures, delays, and errors, but enough of the time to make the difference between effective defense and chaos. The fourth advantage was that Britain had two excellent fighter aircraft. The Hawker Hurricane was sturdy, reliable, relatively easy to build, and carried 8.303 machine guns. It couldn't match the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 in speed or altitude performance, but it was stable enough to be an excellent gun platform, and it could take battle damage and keep flying. The Supermarine Spitfire was faster, could match the Bf-109 in combat, was more agile, and captured the public imagination in a way no other British weapon did. The Hurricane did most of the work in terms of shooting down German bombers, but the Spitfire gave Britain something the Germans had to respect, a fighter that could compete with their best. But Britain also had critical vulnerabilities, and the most serious was pilot shortage. You can build aircraft relatively quickly if you have factories, materials, and skilled workers. Britain's aircraft industry, under the driving leadership of Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, was producing fighters at an impressive rate. By August 1940, British factories were actually building Hurricanes and Spitfires faster than the Germans were building Bf-109s. But you can't build pilots quickly. It takes 6 months to a year to train a fighter pilot to the point where they have a decent chance of surviving combat. It takes years to create experienced squadron leaders and tactical experts. Fighter command was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Worse, the pilots being lost were often the most experienced ones: squadron leaders, flight commanders, veterans with months of combat experience. The replacements arriving at squadrons had maybe 20 hours in the aircraft type they'd be flying in combat, minimal gunnery training, and no combat experience at all. These teenage pilots were being thrown into battle where average life expectancy was measured in weeks. The Germans had their own problems. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, their primary fighter, was an excellent aircraft, arguably the best fighter in the world in 1940, but it had limited range. Flying from bases in France to combat over southern England, a Bf-109 had maybe 15 to 20 minutes of combat time before it had to turn for home or risk running out of fuel over enemy territory. This meant German bombers were only partially protected. It also meant that British fighters could sometimes avoid the escorts and attack the bombers directly. German intelligence was surprisingly poor. They consistently underestimated British aircraft production. They didn't understand Fighter Command's organization or how the radar system worked. They kept claiming they'd destroyed most of the RAF, when in fact British fighter strength was holding relatively steady. This led to strategic mistakes that the British exploited. The battle began in early July 1940 with attacks on the Channel shipping and coastal targets. The Germans were testing British defenses, training their units, and trying to draw RAF fighters into combat on disadvantageous terms. The British were cautious, conserving strength, learning how the Germans operated. But on August 12, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack. This was the main offensive, designed to destroy Fighter Command in days. The targets were RAF airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, anything that kept British fighters in the air. And it nearly worked. August 13th was called Adlertag, Eagle Day. The Luftwaffe launched massive attacks all across southern England. Some attacks hit the wrong targets because of navigation errors or bad intelligence, but others were devastatingly effective. RAF Detling, a coastal command airfield, was virtually destroyed. 22 aircraft smashed, hangars burning, 67 personnel killed. The Germans thought it was a fighter command station, so they declared it a great victory. It wasn't actually relevant to Fighter Command's operations, but the damage was real. For the next 2 weeks, the Luftwaffe kept coming. Day after day, hundreds of German aircraft crossed the Channel, bombed RAF airfields, fought British fighters, and went home to rearm and come back. The pattern was relentless. Radar detected raids forming over France, British fighters scrambled, intercepted the Germans over the Channel or just inland, fought confused dogfights at 20,000 feet while German bombers tried to get through to their targets. And slowly, Fighter Command began to crack. The problem was cumulative damage. An airfield hit one day could be repaired, craters filled in, damaged buildings patched up, and be operational the next day. But an airfield hit 3 days in a row, with hangars destroyed, runways cratered in multiple places, operations rooms damaged, fuel stores blown up. That airfield couldn't function. Squadrons had to relocate. Maintenance became difficult. The system began to fray. Pilot losses were worse. A squadron might start the day with 12 operational pilots. 3 might be shot down. 1 killed, 1 wounded badly enough to be out of action for weeks, 1 bailing out unhurt but shaken. The squadron is now at 9 effective pilots. The next day, 2 more are lost. Now it's at 7. Reinforcements arrive, 2 new pilots with minimal training. 1 is shot down on his 2nd mission. The squadron is at 8, but 2 of those are replacements with almost no experience. The squadron is losing its effectiveness even though it's technically operational. This was happening across Fighter Command. By late August, squadrons were operating at 60 to 70% of their authorized pilot strength. The pilots that were left were flying 4, 5, sometimes 6 missions a day. They were so exhausted that some fell asleep in their cockpits between missions. Others developed nervous disorders, uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, breakdown of coordination. Fighter commanders were making decisions about who pilots were too exhausted or traumatized to fly, but they couldn't rest everyone because there weren't enough pilots to maintain operations. Doubting was rotating entire squadrons out of the battle area, pulling a squadron that had been in heavy combat for weeks and replacing it with a fresh squadron from Northern England or Scotland. But there weren't enough fresh squadrons to maintain the rotation, and the fresh squadrons often had inexperienced pilots who'd never been in combat before. Some were slaughtered in their first encounters with veteran German formations.
The Luftwaffe was also taking heavy losses. Bomber crews were being killed or captured every day. Fighter pilots were dying over England with no chance of rescue. The Luftwaffe was suffering higher absolute losses than the RAF, but the Luftwaffe started with more aircraft and more pilots. It could absorb higher losses and still maintain operations. Fighter Command was smaller. It was defending, which meant it couldn't choose not to fight, and it was running out of time. By the end of August 1940, Fighter Command was in crisis. Several major airfields in southeastern England had been heavily damaged. Biggin Hill, a crucial sector station, was repeatedly bombed and barely functioning. RAF Manston was attacked so many times that it was abandoned as a forward base. Sector operations rooms, the nerve centers that directed fighters to intercepts, were being hit. The entire system was degrading. Dowding was reporting to the Air Ministry that he was losing fighter pilots faster than they could be trained. If the current rate of attrition continued, Fighter Command would be unable to maintain effective defense of southern England within 2 to 3 weeks. He might have to withdraw squadrons north of London to regroup and re-equip, which would leave the invasion beaches undefended. This is the second critical moment I told you about at the beginning. Late August 1940. Fighter Command was weeks, possibly days, from being unable to continue. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its focus on destroying Fighter Command through late August and into September, kept bombing the airfields, kept targeting the sector stations, kept grinding down the RAF, there was a very real possibility it would have succeeded. Not by destroying every British fighter, but by degrading the system to the point where Fighter Command couldn't maintain organized resistance. And then Hitler made a decision that changed everything. On the night of August 24, 1940, several German bombers, possibly lost or off course, dropped bombs on central London. This violated Hitler's standing orders. Hitler had specifically forbidden attacks on London because he didn't want to escalate to city bombing, which would invite British retaliation against German cities and make eventual peace negotiations more difficult. But the bombs fell anyway. British civilians died. Churchill immediately ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The RAF managed to get a formation of bombers to Berlin on the night of August 25th. The raid didn't cause much damage. Berlin's defenses were strong, and the RAF bombers were at the limit of their range. But the psychological impact in Germany was enormous. Berliners had been told repeatedly by Göring that their city would never be bombed, that the Luftwaffe had made the Reich capital invulnerable. The appearance of British bombers over Berlin, even if they didn't do much damage, was a humiliation for Göring and for the Nazi regime.
Göring had personally promised that no enemy aircraft would ever reach Berlin. Now British bombers were dropping explosives on the German capital. Hitler was furious. At a rally in Berlin on September 4, 1940, he gave a speech in which he promised that if Britain continued to bomb German cities, Germany would erase their cities from the map. He told Göring to shift the Luftwaffe's focus from attacking the RAF to attacking London. The goal now was to bomb London so heavily that British civilian morale would break and force Churchill's government to negotiate. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its first massive daylight raid on London. Nearly 350 bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, attacked the London docks and the East End. The docks were a legitimate military target. They were crucial for British trade and supply. But the docks were also surrounded by densely packed working-class neighborhoods. The bombing set the docks ablaze and spread fire into residential areas. Over 430 civilians were killed that first day. The fires were so massive they could be seen from 60 miles away. The bombing continued that night, and the night after that, and the night after that. The Blitz had begun. For the next 8 months, German bombers would attack London and other British cities almost every night. Tens of thousands of British civilians would die. Huge sections of London would be destroyed. It was terrible. It was brutal. It was indiscriminate warfare against civilian populations. And it was the salvation of Fighter Command. The moment the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from RAF airfields to London, the pressure on Fighter Command eased. Damaged airfields could be repaired, operations rooms could be restored, exhausted squadrons could be rotated out for rest, new pilots could complete their training without being thrown immediately into combat, aircraft production could catch up to losses. The Germans didn't understand what they'd done. From their perspective, they were escalating pressure to break British will. From the British perspective, they'd just been given breathing space to survive. The battle in September became a different kind of fight. The Luftwaffe was still trying to destroy the RAF, but now it had to do it by forcing Fighter Command to defend London. The British had to defend London, politically and morally. They couldn't let the capital be destroyed without resistance. But they could choose when and how to engage. They were fighting over their own territory, with radar direction, with the advantage of shorter distances to base. September 15, 1940 is remembered as the climax of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids on London that day. The Germans believed that Fighter Command was nearly finished, that one more major effort would break British resistance. Göring personally ordered that every available aircraft was to be committed to destroying the RAF once and for all. Instead, the Luftwaffe ran into a fully prepared defense. Fighter Command threw everything available into the battle. Over 300 British fighters engaged the German formations. The sky over London and southeastern England was filled with aircraft. Dogfights raged at altitudes from 15,000 to 30,000 feet. British pilots shot down German bombers in full view of London's population. People in the streets watched contrails weaving patterns in the sky, watched aircraft falling, counted parachutes. The initial British claims of German losses that day were exaggerated. Battle reports always are, because pilots in the confusion of combat genuinely believe they've shot down aircraft that actually made it home. The British claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed. The actual German losses were 61 aircraft destroyed and around 150 damaged. The British lost 31 fighters with 13 pilots killed. But the exact numbers didn't matter as much as what they represented. The Luftwaffe had thrown its maximum effort at Britain and been stopped. Fighter Command was still intact, still fighting, still capable of contesting every raid. The German bombers couldn't operate over Britain without prohibitive losses. 2 days later, on September 17, 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off. Without air superiority, an amphibious invasion was impossible. This is the third critical moment I told you would understand. September 7th to September 17th, 1940. Hitler's decision to switch from attacking Fighter Command to attacking London gave the RAF time to recover. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its focus on destroying Fighter Command through late August and into September, kept bombing the airfields, kept targeting the sector stations, kept grinding down the RAF, there is a very real possibility it would have succeeded. Not by destroying every British fighter, but by degrading the system to the point where Fighter Command couldn't maintain organized resistance.
The battle didn't end on September 15th. The Luftwaffe continued to bomb British cities through the autumn and winter. The Blitz killed over 40,000 British civilians before it finally ended in May 1941. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth, Bristol, all were heavily bombed. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Thousands of families lost their homes. Children were killed in their beds when bombs fell on residential streets. But the Blitz wasn't strategic victory. It was revenge, terror, an attempt to break civilian morale. It didn't force Britain to surrender. It didn't eliminate Britain's ability to continue fighting. It didn't prevent Britain from serving as a base for eventual liberation of Europe. Britain had survived. That's what the Battle of Britain was ultimately about, survival. Not victory in any traditional sense, but simply remaining in the war long enough for circumstances to change. And circumstances did change. Hitler, unable to defeat Britain, turned east. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declared war on the United States. Suddenly, Britain wasn't alone anymore. The war would continue for another 4 years, would cost millions more lives, would devastate Europe. But the outcome was no longer predetermined. None of that would have happened if Britain had fallen or negotiated peace in 1940. So let's come back to those 3 moments. First, May 28, 1940, Churchill, in the War Cabinet, argues against negotiation with Germany despite overwhelming pressure to seek terms. If Halifax wins that argument, Britain begins peace negotiations. There is no Battle of Britain because Britain isn't fighting. Germany controls Europe, America stays neutral, and the trajectory of the 20th century is completely different. Second, late August 1940. Fighter Command is within days of being unable to maintain effective resistance. Airfields are damaged, pilots are exhausted, losses are mounting. If the Luftwaffe maintains focus on destroying the RAF for another week or 2, Fighter Command may have to withdraw north of London. Southern England becomes undefendable. Operation Sea Lion becomes feasible. Third, September 7, 1940. Hitler, enraged by the bombing of Berlin, orders the Luftwaffe to shift focus from RAF airfields to London. This gives Fighter Command time to recover. 2 weeks later, Hitler postpones the invasion indefinitely. The immediate crisis passes. At each of these moments, the outcome hung on decisions made by individuals. Churchill's refusal to negotiate, Dowding's management of Fighter Command's resources, Hitler's decision to bomb London. None of these outcomes were inevitable. Different decisions would have led to different results. That's what makes this story matter beyond just being a tale of military history. It's a demonstration that individuals can affect outcomes even in situations that seem determined by vast impersonal forces. Churchill couldn't conjure up more fighter aircraft or more trained pilots. He couldn't make Britain militarily stronger than Germany, but he could refuse to quit. That refusal kept Britain in the war long enough for other factors, Hitler's mistakes, British resilience, eventual American entry, to matter. The RAF pilots who fought the Battle of Britain, 3,000 men from Britain, the Commonwealth, and occupied countries who served in Fighter Command that summer, couldn't see the bigger picture. They were focused on survival, on the next mission, on protecting each other, on getting one more bomber before running out of ammunition. Many of them were teenagers. The average age of a fighter pilot in 1940 was 22 years old. Some were as young as 18. They were frightened, exhausted, and watching friends die every day. But collectively, they created an outcome that the strategic calculations said was impossible. They kept Fighter Command operational through 12 weeks of desperate fighting. They made Hitler's invasion plan unworkable.
They gave Churchill's refusal to negotiate meaning. And the British people themselves validated that refusal through their response to the Blitz. The bombing was supposed to break civilian morale, to create pressure on Churchill's government to negotiate. Instead, it hardened British resolve. People who'd been uncertain about whether the war was worth fighting became absolutely certain when bombs fell on their neighborhoods. The intended effect, breaking morale, produced the opposite result. This is why this story endures 85 years later. It's not a simple tale of good versus evil, though there were clearly better and worse causes in 1940. It's not a story of superior British virtue or capability. The Germans were skilled, brave, and fighting for what they believed in, even if what they believed in was monstrous. It's a story about human beings refusing to accept what all the calculations said was inevitable, about political courage mattering as much as military skill, about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances doing what they thought they had to do, about the margin between survival and disaster being razor thin, measured sometimes in days or hours, dependent on decisions that could have gone either way. The Battle of Britain was the summer when courage mattered more than calculations, when one man's refusal to do the sensible thing kept a nation in a war it couldn't win until circumstances changed and it could. When a few hundred young men in fighter aircraft held off the most powerful military machine in the world just barely long enough, when Hitler's first major strategic defeat altered the course of a war that would eventually destroy him. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't foreordained. It was contingent on choices and mistakes and desperation and skill and luck, all coming together in Britain's favor by the narrowest of margins. That's the story. That's why it matters. That's why we still tell it. Because sometimes, just sometimes, refusing to accept what's inevitable changes what's possible. Sometimes courage matters more than logic. Sometimes holding on long enough for circumstances to change is the only strategy available, and sometimes it's enough. Churchill gambled everything on that belief in May 1940. The RAF pilots proved it true through the summer. The British people confirmed it through the Blitz. And by November 1940, when it became clear that Britain had survived, that Hitler's invasion wouldn't happen, that the war would continue, that refusal, that gamble, that choice not to quit had changed history. Britain won the Battle of Britain not because victory was certain, but because enough people believed it was possible and fought accordingly. That belief, sustained through months of desperate fighting against overwhelming odds, made true what might have remained impossible. And that's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth holding on to. Because your impossible moments will come too, different form, different stakes, but the same essential choice. Accept what everyone says is inevitable, or refuse and fight for what you believe might be possible. Churchill refused. The RAF fought. Britain survived, and the world changed because of it.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.